Hello again, and welcome to this webinar on the Mobile Gender Gap Report 2019. My name is Oliver Roundtree, and I'm Senior Insights Manager in the Connected Women team at the GSMA. So, in terms of the agenda for this webinar, we will start off by giving a brief introduction to the Connected Women team within the GSMA, detailing how we work with mobile operators to close the gender gap. We'll then give some background on the research that fed into this report before really diving into the details of the findings of that research, and then ending with some recommendations for how stakeholders can work to address the mobile gender gap. We'll leave some time for questions at the end. So please do feel free to write any questions in the Q&A as we go along, or add in questions right at the end. So to give a little bit of background on the Connected Women team. So Connected Women within the GSMA has two areas of focus: working to reduce the gender gap in mobile internet and mobile money usage in low and middle income countries. So we do that through three work streams: advocacy, working with the international community, working with different stakeholders to advocate for the correct approaches to addressing the mobile gender gap in these markets; market engagement, really working on the ground, particularly with the mobile industry, to find strategies that work to close the gender gap on a country by country basis. And then through our insights work stream, working on pieces of research such as this one that really find what the current state of play is in terms of the mobile gender gap and identify from consumer and data research and analysis what are the best ways to address the gender gap. And through these work streams, there's a few things that we're trying to achieve. First off, we're trying to fundamentally increase access to and use of life-enhancing mobile services by women. Secondly, and of course this point shouldn't be ignored, is to really drive growth both of the mobile industry and of the economy more broadly. And then finally, achieving the sustainable development goals, where mobile and technology are a huge fundamental enabler of the achievement of these goals over the next few decades, given the growing importance of technology. So Connected Women works across lower middle income countries, taking formal commitments from mobile operators to work to address the gender gap in their mobile internet or mobile money customer base. To date, we've received 52 formal commitments from 37 different operators to address the gender gap in their customer base. And we work closely with these mobile operators to find commercially sustainable business models that work to close the gender gap. So currently, to date, Connected Women and our partners have reached over 16 million new women with mobile money or mobile internet services in these markets. And that means that life-enhancing services have been delivered to more than 31 million women through the Connected Women Commitment Initiative and other efforts by the program. So, to give a little bit more background on this piece of research specifically, this is the second year in a row where we have published a mobile gender gap report. So we're excited that this allows us to start making some more concrete year-on-year comparisons as to how the mobile gender gap is changing over time. This piece of research also follows on from a 2015 report that we published on the same topic. So we had four main research objectives when we went into examining the mobile gender gap this year. So first off, we wanted to be able to, again, size the gender gap in mobile ownership and mobile internet use, and that's changing over time. We also wanted to be able to look beyond just ownership and access to how the actual usage of mobile differs between men and women. Then we wanted to be able to look at what was preventing ownership, access, and usage for both men and women. and identify what are the key things that need to be addressed by stakeholders to close the gender gap. And then finally, we wanted to be able to look at both the economic and commercial opportunity from closing the gender gap in order to better articulate why stakeholders should take action on this issue. And we'll talk through all of these points in this presentation today. So, as well as our own research, we looked to a range of different external sources, including data from organizations such as the ITU, After Access, and Pew. So the data that we'll be talking through today comes from the GSMA Intelligence Consumer Survey 2018. So this is a large-scale survey that covers 18 low and middle income countries. You can see the ones highlighted in teal on the map are those that we've covered. So through this survey, we speak to over 20,000 respondents with face-to-face interviews. And that's representative of 69% of the population of low and middle income countries. Where we don't cover countries, we build an extrapolation model to estimate the values for those countries. So what did we find through this research? Well, I would say that one of the most significant things that we found was that in low and middle income countries, today 80% of women own a mobile phone. And I think in many ways that's an incredible number and is also an incredible achievement. But in many of the poorest countries in the world, this technology is now reaching millions of people and millions more people than it was reaching even just 5 years ago. But this does raise an important question. Do we still need to be talking about the mobile gender gap, or is the job done? Well, no, I think there's still important work that needs to be done, and there's two main reasons why this is the case. So broadly, these two reasons are, while 80% is an incredible figure, it does mask important regional inequalities. So the women who potentially stand to benefit the most from mobile ownership and use are still arguably the furthest away from having access. And then secondly, mobile isn't just about ownership. It's about enabling access to a huge range of empowering and life-enhancing services. And when we look further along the mobile user journey, the gender gap widens at each stage. So perhaps now we need to be focusing our attention further along that user journey. So to give an example, amongst women in low and middle income countries who use the internet, 61% of them only ever do so on a mobile phone. In Bangladesh, that figure is as high as 89%. So mobile ownership is a really important enabler of deeper digital inclusion as well. So looking deeper into the mobile ownership gender gap, while 80% of women now own a mobile phone across low and middle income countries, that still means that over 400 million women are unconnected. And the gender gap has remained constant at 10% year on year across low and middle income countries. So that is not closing. On this map, you can see the gender gap for each region, for low and middle income countries within each region of the world. So each of those numbers in the red bubbles represents the regional gender gap. So looking at this map, it's also important to highlight that while in some regions there's a fair amount of gender parity in terms of mobile ownership, in other regions there's a huge amount of inequality in ownership. In particular, Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia have the largest mobile ownership gender gaps in the world. So in Sub-Saharan Africa, women are 15% less likely than men to own a mobile phone. And in South Asia, they're 28% less likely. In some countries, this widens even further. So we'll talk through some of these country examples a little bit later on. Moving on to my second reason why the mobile gender gap is still a critical issue. Mobile ownership is really just the first important step towards wider digital inclusion through a mobile phone. So we tend to look at this high-level user journey framework to understand digital inclusion through mobile. So with the most important objective at the end of the journey being the ability to use a diverse and beneficial range of mobile internet services. Digital inclusion will be increasingly important for the wider social and economic inclusion of women in the future. So we need to consider the gender gap at each stage of this user journey to be able to fully understand what is the scale and importance of the mobile gender gap overall. So let's move further along this user journey and look at what happens at each stage. So at the second stage of this user journey, we look at awareness. This chart shows awareness of mobile internet by country. So the teal bar on top shows awareness amongst men, and the red bar on the bottom for each country shows awareness among women. So although we might assume that even in developing countries, everybody is aware of the internet, of Facebook, and of WhatsApp, the data tells us that that is not true. In the countries with the lowest levels of mobile internet penetration, many people still aren't aware of the internet and of the fact that it can be used on a mobile phone. And that level of awareness tends to be significantly lower for women. Taking the example of India, only 42% of women are aware of mobile internet versus 59% of men. It's worth highlighting, though, that this does represent a significant growth year on year. We found that 19% of women in India were aware of mobile internet last year. So this is potentially growing fairly quickly, in fact. So both the ownership gap that we talked through previously and then this awareness gap still contribute to an even wider gender gap in mobile internet use. Women in lower middle income countries are still 23% less likely than men to use mobile internet. And that translates to 1.1 billion women across low middle income countries who still don't use it. And that gender gap is wider in every region that we looked at than the gender gap in mobile ownership. And again, that gap widens in certain regions. And again, the gap is widest in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where it's 58%. It's also interesting to note that actually year on year, we did see a reduction in the mobile internet gender gap across low and middle income countries. So in our study on this topic last year, we found a gap across low and middle income countries of 26%, which could suggest that this gap is reducing. Although it's still too early to draw any concrete conclusions about a longer term trend. We saw a lot of that closure year on year coming from India, where fast changing market dynamics have led to greater affordability of data and easier access, arguably, to mobile internet for women. As I mentioned previously, even within regions, there are significant variations in the scale of the mobile gender gap. So on this slide, you can see some examples. For example, in Mozambique, we found that women were 24% less likely than men to own a mobile phone and 59% less likely to use mobile internet. So significantly higher than the regional average for Africa overall. Equally, in Pakistan, only 11% of women use mobile internet compared to 38% of men, which represents a huge 71% gender gap, the highest of all of the markets that we looked at. Even looking beyond the national level, in urban areas, typically the gap is smaller, and in rural areas, the gap widens. So taking India again, for example, there is a gender gap of 20% in urban areas compared to a 41% gender gap in rural areas. So even where we may not see a gender gap at the country or at the regional level, there are still many important inequalities in access that need to be addressed. So again, moving further along that user journey beyond just access and adoption towards usage. And we find that even once women and men own a mobile phone or adopt mobile internet, a gap still emerges in how they use their mobiles. So again, looking at the case of India, if we look at the perhaps more basic or simple use case of making or receiving calls, we see relative gender parity. 83% of men and women made phone calls on their mobile phones. But as we look further along the user journey towards more sophisticated and potentially more beneficial internet internet-based use cases, the gap widens further. So looking at downloading and using apps, only 14% of female mobile owners did so, compared to 32% of men in India. So, as well as examining these specific use cases, we looked at across a range of different use cases which were covered through the GSMA Intelligence Consumer Survey. And we categorized respondents based on the number of these distinct use cases that they reported using on at least a weekly basis. So this demonstrates how this usage gap emerges on a more granular level. And we found that men in most countries were likely to use a larger, more diverse number of mobile use cases on a more regular basis. So again, taking the example of India, 69% of female mobile owners use between 1 and 5 types of mobile-based services per week, compared to 57% of men, while 18% of male mobile owners use over 10 types of mobile-based services a week versus only 7% of women. So if we think about this as representative of the sort of more engaged and perhaps more sophisticated users of mobile in most of the countries that we looked at, that tended to be disproportionately made up of men, which is suggestive of the fact that even beyond just adoption or uptake of specific services, on a more granular level, usage levels and therefore the value that users are getting out of mobile are higher for men in most low and middle income countries. And these usage gaps also translate into a gender gap in spending on mobile, even amongst mobile owners, which you can see on this slide. So with each of these bars representing the gender gap in spending amongst mobile owners, spending on mobile services. So this spending gap suggests that there's an even wider gap in the intensity of usage of these services, even beyond this uptake of services that we talked through on the previous slide. So across lower middle income countries, female mobile owners spend on average 17% less on their mobile phones than men. And interestingly, this gap exists even in countries where there's no gender gap in ownership or in mobile internet use. So taking, for example, Argentina, which has a slightly negative gender gap in both, but actually has a 10% gender gap in mobile spending. So this indicates that even those women who do own and use a mobile phone are still using them less intensely and for a less diverse and useful range of services, even in the more digitally mature countries. So why is this gender gap persisting? And why does it exist in the first place? And why is it not closing? Well, there's two broad themes that underpin the barriers to mobile ownership and usage of mobile internet and lead to them disproportionately impacting on women. So the first is demographic barriers, as you can see on the left. So women across lower middle income countries make up a disproportionate proportion of more marginalized demographic groups. Women are almost twice as likely as men to be illiterate in low and middle income countries and are less than half as likely to participate in the labor force. These factors are both ones that are strongly correlated with being able to access, own, and use a mobile phone. So these factors compound and accentuate the barriers that women face to ownership and use of a mobile. But there are also more specific social norms which affect and influence women specifically in lower middle income countries. In many of the markets that we look at, these social norms can limit women's mobility and financial autonomy and their ability to make decisions about their own purchases, such as owning a mobile phone. It can also make gatekeepers feel that mobile ownership is inappropriate for women and could be a distraction from their responsibilities. So both of these factors contribute to the mobile gender gap, and they're not likely to disappear anytime soon. So we need to find ways to mitigate their effects in causing a gender gap in mobile ownership and use. As well as looking into these factors, we asked a large range of questions about the specific self-identified barriers that both men and women felt to mobile ownership and use. So we asked about the influence of 13 barriers to mobile ownership and 18 barriers for mobile internet use. We grouped these into similar themes, and then we ranked them across all lower middle income countries to identify the most important barriers. And here you can see the ranking that we found across low and middle income countries that we covered. And this is a ranking both for men and women, because once we aggregated it in this way, we found that the ranking across all these regions was actually the same for men and women. We found similar themes for ownership and mobile internet use, but with important differences. For mobile ownership, it might not be surprising to find that the number one barrier for both men and women preventing them from owning a mobile phone was the affordability of handsets. So we might think that this challenge has been addressed with the erosion of handset prices, but it absolutely has not. For those people who still don't own one, even the lowest cost handsets can still be a prohibitive expense, which prevents their acquisition of a mobile phone. When we look at mobile internet, it was interesting to find that, in fact, literacy and digital skills came above affordability as the top barrier in many of the markets that we looked at. So this occurs both because of women's lower levels of literacy in many countries, which, as we saw on the previous slide, is a factor that tends to disproportionately affect women. But it's also a lack of confidence with digital skills for women, which often manifests as less confidence in independently acquiring these digital skills and less confidence in using a mobile. We also found that in many countries, relevance was a key topic, both for mobile ownership and for mobile internet use. A lack of understanding of how mobile can be relevant in their lives and how the internet can actually help them on a day-to-day basis can be a real impediment to people wanting to acquire and use a mobile phone, and a lack of understanding of what the value for money is in doing so. Equally, a lack of understanding of the content that they could access and the services that they could make use of. Safety and security issues are also a very important barrier in many markets that we looked at. This is an issue that many of our partner operators are taking action to address, to ensure that women feel safer on their mobiles and feel safer online. Safety and security is particularly an issue that we found emerging in Latin America, where it was the number one barrier in many countries that we looked at. So we've looked at the problem, but it's also important to note that closing the mobile gender gap represents a substantial opportunity, both for the industry and for society at large. So when we used our extrapolation model to estimate what the impact of closing the gender gap would be, we found that over 5 years, if the mobile industry in low and middle income countries could close the gender gap in mobile ownership and mobile internet usage, in mobile ownership and mobile usage, this could present a $140 billion commercial opportunity. So there's a real commercial incentive for the industry to take action. But equally, if we could close the gender gap in mobile internet use in lower and middle income countries over 5 years, this could drive an additional $700 billion of GDP growth. So that represents an additional 0.7% of GDP growth over those 5 years. So this means that while it should be a high priority for industry, it's also critical for governments and international organizations. The internet's going to be an incredibly important driver of economic growth in the future. And if we don't equalize access for men and women, gender inequalities are at risk of being reinforced and exacerbated. So looking beyond this data, it's also true that closing the mobile gender gap can benefit women as individuals. Mobile can empower women and ensure that they're digitally included. It also brings important benefits to society more broadly, and of course, critically, it can contribute to the achievement of the UN SDGs. UN SDG 5 on gender equality, but mobile and closing the mobile gender gap also critically underpins a number of the other important SDGs, such as addressing poverty, allowing access to quality education, and many others. So I've run through a lot of figures and facts, but there's a few key takeaways that I want you to leave this webinar with. The first is that now 80% of women in low and middle income countries own a mobile phone. But there's still a gender gap. Mobile phone, and this gender gap is not reducing. Furthermore, women are 23% less likely than men to use mobile internet in low and middle income countries. And this gender gap extends beyond just ownership and access to usage. Looking further down that user journey, the gap widens at each stage, and this manifests further in a gender gap in mobile spending. The widest gender gaps, both in ownership and mobile internet use, are found in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. Affordability is the number one barrier for mobile ownership, particularly affordability of handsets. And finally, literacy and digital skills are the top barriers to mobile internet use across low and middle income countries. Having talked through the problem, it's important to consider what actions organizations can and should take to address the mobile gender gap. In the full Mobile Gender Gap Report 2019, you can find a complete set of 29 recommendations broken down by stakeholder type. But we believe that there's a few recommendations that all stakeholders should consider and take action on. First is to understand and address women's needs and barriers in your market, and consider the effects of social norms and how to mitigate their effect on women's digital inclusion. The second is to involve women in the design and implementation of products, services, and policies, and make sure that these are tested with female end users. The third is to improve the quality and availability of gender data, and then set targets on this data and track progress against them. That's really the only way to know what is working and whether progress is being made. So as I say, in the full report, we provide stakeholder-specific recommendations that align to each of the 5 themes that we've identified as important barriers in low and middle income countries. So I would very much recommend that you take a look at the full report and see which of these recommendations are most relevant for you. But to give a few examples, we found that affordability was a particularly important barrier. And one example of an action that stakeholders can take is to support the industry in working to lower the cost of handsets at the point of purchase. So this can support widening access for women both to mobiles and to mobile internet. For digital literacy and digital skills, there's a lot of action that needs to be taken. One example is running digital skills training for new users as a critical way of better onboarding new users who may find the internet a difficult thing to navigate when they first get online. So giving them a nudge in the right direction just as they're getting online can really be a powerful way of increasing their engagement and increasing the value that they get from the internet. Looking at safety and security, one particular example of an action we would recommend is that internet services need to be created that make women feel safer and more secure online, and also give them more control of their digital presence. Looking at relevance, this is a particularly important barrier for mobile internet. So many stakeholders need to find ways to better communicate how mobile internet and mobile ownership more broadly can be relevant for women's day-to-day lives, how they can make them more empowered and better able to access important services. And then finally, accessibility. One key example here is that providers need to make sure that services are provided in local languages rather than just English or other international languages. And again, this is an issue that does affect both men and women, but particularly and disproportionately affects women and makes uptake and use of internet-based services a challenge. So thank you again for joining this webinar. I will be very happy to take any questions. As well as that, I very much recommend that you take a look at the full report. There's much more detail behind many of the things that we have talked through today, including that recommendations table, which is much more fleshed out in the full report. But for now, please add your questions into the Q&A section of the interface or add them directly to the chat, and we will take take a look and address them. Please bear with us while we take a look at the questions. So there may be a brief pause while we review. Thank you. So we have a great question here on what specifically we mean by safety and security as a barrier. So whether that means being taken advantage of by fraudsters or being robbed for the handset. And yeah, that's a great question. The short answer is both. Clearly, there are two important different dimensions. There is sort of real world safety implications around being robbed, having a handset stolen, the kind of the additional risk that one is exposed to on a day-to-day basis when owning a mobile handset, particularly a smartphone. And then there are sort of new and specific dangers and risks that one might be exposed to online or through calling scams. So both of those themes are important, and interestingly in Latin America both of those themes emerge as very important considerations. But it's worth saying that we do find these to be important themes in many other markets as well as issues such as harassment through a mobile and things like this. So again, I would direct you to the full report, where if you flick to the end of the report, you can find a very, very detailed table that provides all of the individual level barriers that make up themes such as safety and security. And you can really see which of the constituent parts are of particular relevance in each individual market. So we have one on whether our research covered the use of local languages in increasing adoption. So things like audio messages. This wasn't something that we specifically covered through this research, but through other research, we've definitely found that the growing availability of local language content is being an important driver of increased, for example, mobile internet uptake. If we look at the example of, say, YouTube in India, where local video content, which is searchable through voice, is really, really opening up and widening access to internet-based content for both men and women with perhaps lower levels of literacy. But in general, we find things such as audio messages, yes, can be a really critical way of overcoming barriers around literacy or a lack of availability of local language interfaces or content. So again, while not covered in this report specifically, it is something that we have found can be an important solution. We have another question on whether the presentation will be emailed out. So just to say, we will email around a recording of this webinar. We won't email out the presentation as a matter of course, because I would, again, direct you to the full report, which includes all of the content that we talked through today. However, if you'd specifically like a copy of the presentation, please do email connectedwomen@gsma.com and we'll be happy to provide you the slides. We've got a great question here on this point around the fact that women are less likely to spend on mobile internet, etc., and the fact that women tend to play a pivotal role in families, especially in low-income countries, and may have to make difficult choices between spending on food, healthcare, school fees, etc. So mobile services will often take a backseat to these things, and absolutely. And to be clear, when talking about mobile spending, um, often we're considering this to be sort of a proxy for deeper mobile engagement and mobile usage. And absolutely, there's a lot of competing priorities that disproportionately impact on women in lower middle income countries. And this is kind of what we were alluding to with these specific social norms that are particular barriers to women's mobile ownership and usage. So completely agree. There's a lot of factors that influence these differences in spending for men and women. And so it's not necessarily something that we would expect to equalize immediately, but it is a marker of the fact that these additional roles and responsibilities that women hold are a factor also that prevents their getting as much value out of technology and out of the internet as men, which does risk further compounding what can sometimes be a marginalized, or very often be a marginalized position in society. So technology could be at risk of, rather than solving these inequalities, further compounding them. We have a question on whether the survey and research also cover gaps on mobile money usage. So no, this isn't something that we have covered through this piece of research. We have previously done several pieces of research on mobile money, including one that I would direct you towards specifically on mobile money usage in Cote d'Ivoire and Mali, where we used a similar customer journey framework to understand how that user journey differed for both men and women. If you would be interested, please do email the team and we can send you a link to that report. But otherwise, I would direct you to the GSMA's SOTIR, which also has some gender-specific findings, and of course, excellent data from organizations such as Findex and Financial Inclusion Insights, which give further gender disaggregated information on mobile money as well. So we have a question on what kind of tools are used to measure these gaps and how we keep the gender gap estimates percentages up to date. So as I mentioned early on in the presentation, the approach that we use is an annual consumer survey that is run across a wide range of lower middle income countries. So we take the results of these nationally representative surveys, and from that we derive the gender gap in ownership, usage, and all the metrics we've talked through today. The Connected Women team does also work with supply side data directly from the industry, which tells a very similar story around those differences in ownership and usage by men and women of mobile overall, mobile internet, and also mobile money. So we find similarly that when we look at transactional data and operator data, we find that those gaps tend to widen further amongst the high power users of these services. So, but all the findings that we've talked to today are from the demand side consumer survey. We have a question on when we'll next be doing the same survey and whether we partner with organizations to narrow down the scope. So our intention would be to publish our next Mobile Gender Gap report at Mobile World Congress 2020. So we aim for this to be an annual series. So do watch out for the next edition as well. We haven't partnered with other organizations as a matter of course, but if you're interested in exploring these things, then do feel free to get in touch with the Connected Women team if you have any specific thoughts. Apologies for the long delay there. Um, we had a question on whether we have country data for other countries in the EU and other more developed regions. We don't currently, and we don't currently engage with operators in those markets as a matter of course within the Connected Women team. We have seen data for those countries which suggests that there is a gap outside of just lower middle income countries, at least in some markets. But it's not something that we've systematically engaged with the industry on. But if you have specific thoughts on engagements that you'd like to begin, then please do get in touch with us and we'll be more than happy to discuss it. We have a very interesting question on whether our research measures the gap between what women are entitled to access on mobile and what they actually end up using. So no, this isn't something that we've looked at specifically, but it's a very interesting point whether women are tending to have more sort of leftover minutes or leftover data. So as you mentioned, there can be issues around sort of access to a mobile phone, whether that device is shared between people within the household. For example, whether there's an expectation that a woman's mobile phone will also be used by children within the household. So I would imagine there could be a good chance that this would see a difference by gender, but it's not something that we have specifically looked into in the past. So we've got a question on affordability of handsets, whether there are any numbers to show what prices are affordable, and how country specific that will be. It's a great question, and it is one that we are intending to look into more deeply ourselves. For the moment, I would direct you towards a report that we authored a couple of years ago on accelerating smartphone affordability in lower middle income countries, written in partnership with our Connected Society team within the GSMA, where we did do some work to look at what proportion of people's income the lowest cost smartphones represented, and of course found that it made up a very, very high proportion with current costs of the lower income brackets in a couple of the markets that we looked at. I believe the focus markets were Tanzania and India. So that wasn't something that we looked at as this piece of research specifically, but I would direct you to that report for some data on this. Do get in touch if you'd like me to send a link to that report specifically. So we just got a question about how we calculate the gender gap. So, for example, in Pakistan, how it is calculated as 71%. So we calculate it as a relative difference rather than an absolute percentage point gap, as we feel that this better reflects sort of the gender differential at lower levels of penetration. So it is calculated as the calculation works out as female uptake minus male uptake divided by male uptake. got a request for me to explain the data from one of the specific slides. Um, Let me see if I can. You mentioned in your question slide 22, which is the key takeaways slide. Would you mind just adding in another question if you can give more specifically what you wanted me to explain, because I'm not sure which data point you are looking at there. Otherwise, I'll get to some other questions in the meantime. So we've got a question on whether our research points to the use of feature phones instead of smartphones within this gap. So a great question, and yes, this is something that we intend to look into in more depth, is this kind of smartphone gap. As you're absolutely right, a huge factor here is not just mobile ownership, but specifically smartphone ownership, which can be a much more sort of powerful enabler of digital inclusion. So it's not something that we've published in the report, but we definitely see a wider gender gap in smartphone ownership than in other types of device ownership. So there are a disproportionate number of females feature phone owners within the overall handset owner mix in many of the countries that we look at. Although this dynamic can vary quite considerably. So if we're taking feature phones as mobile phones that can access the internet but are not smartphones, then in many countries these are relatively quickly declining. In some markets, they're still very relevant. Taking, for example, the geophone in India. But yes, we do tend to see smartphones have a gender gap in their ownership, in particular amongst handsets overall. We've got a question on whether we have a ranking on SDG 5B indicator measurement specifically. No, it's not something I have to hand. If you're looking for anything in particular, then please do get in touch and I can speak to the team more broadly, but it's not something I have to hand. And then we have I see. So we have a question on how we calculated 80% ownership, but a 10% gender gap and a 23% gap in mobile internet use. So 80% ownership is for women in low middle income countries, and actually male ownership in low and middle income countries is 90%, which adds up to a 10% gender gap. While that sounds like that's a 10 percentage point gender gap, it is not. It's just because it's close to 100%. So this is also calculated with the same methodology that I described previously. So that relative gap rather than an absolute gap. So again, the 23% gender gap in mobile internet use, that is from taking the absolute number of mobile internet subscribers across all low and middle income countries. So this is not a crude average across the countries that we surveyed. This is modeled figures for every single low and middle income countries. So when we sum up mobile owners and mobile internet users across all of those countries, this is the gender gap that we find. We've got a question on how we're engaging with policy in Commonwealth countries. I I think best if I direct you to some of my colleagues who can give you the most in-depth response on that. So please do drop an email or drop a comment, and we'll follow up separately on that point, as I think there could be certainly be an interesting conversation there. So thanks everybody for the fantastic questions. We will follow up to any of you that have sent us a specific request. And if you have any further ones, then please do email either connectedwomen@gsma.com, or you can email me directly at oroundtree@gsma.com. Thank you again, and do get in touch with any further questions that may arise.